right. Now, what about Africa? At the time that Marcus Garvey was in his prime, okay, I understand that the Atlantic, the Black Star Line was designed also to take people of the diaspora back home, and a lot of things that have happened then. But I want you to explain the message to me even before then. That how was the message of Marcus Garvey received in Africa? At the time in Africa, how was the African people getting the message? And what were they saying? How were they reacting to the message?
The reaction of African people to that message at different levels were different. The large mass of African people at that time, engaged as they were in the anti-colonial struggles with the British and the French and the Belgians, etc., the broad mass of the African people were quite unaware at the time of even the desire for the African diaspora to make that link with Africa. At the level of the elite, however, there was that desire, there was that knowledge, and at the level of the elite, there were mixed reactions as far as that is concerned. Now, as I have pointed out, Senghor was one of those who had a fair understanding of what people like Garvey would be trying to achieve, what people like earlier on, like W.E.B. Du Bois in the United States were trying to achieve, and they were open to the ideas. They were open to the ideas at several levels, at the political level, at the cultural level, and the cultural level is very important. And a number of people on the African continent understood that. It was much later, I think in the 50s, but it comes out of that movement. It was much later in the 50s that people like Amilcar Cabral would point out that it was important for the liberation of Black people to return to the source of culture, return to the source of the understanding of oneself as a people, not as a people fractured across the world, but as a people united by what he saw as a common destiny. So that there were differing responses to it. However, as the national liberation movement spread throughout Africa, and I might as well add Asia as well, because the national liberation movement was now taking root, responding to colonialism worldwide. As it took root, there was a larger understanding of the mass of the people, that the common struggles of all our peoples on the different continents and in the diaspora was very, very important and was critical to the freedom of all. However, at the very same time that we were coming to that kind of understanding, there were all efforts to divide us. And so along the lines of what was going on with the French and what was going on with the British, they sought to divide people along these lines. But there were people and there were movements that transcended that. And I'm sure your mind would go back to Frantz Fanon, who was also from Martinique, and in fact who was born in Dominica, one of the other islands, but then grew up in Martinique. And it was Frantz Fanon who later, after going to study in France, found himself fighting in the national liberation movement in Algeria. And so not even, I mean, it's a common practice. They like to divide people into sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa and East Africa, and make us believe that that we are different people and our destinies are not the same. Even up to now, we see that certain people, even in places like Tunisia, would have bought into that kind of division. But as I say, at different levels in the society, the African people on the continent were becoming very receptive, and they understood that our destiny lay together.
Thank you so much for that. In the course of the interview that I've done here, at some point, I understood that at the time, the publication of Marcus Garvey were getting to Africa. But anyway, what kind of Africa are we even talking about so that we can understand? At the time, a lot of countries in Africa were not even free. I don't know how many of them were even free. It was still a period of colonialism. All of them, maybe nearly all of them, were under the control of the European. So what kind of engagement are we even supposed to have anyway? So for the colonial government to see you with the copies of the publication of Marcus Garvey was a big trouble. Someone said it was almost like an execution.
Yes.
All right. So yeah, please go.
Yes. And this was considered to be seditious literature. So you were not supposed to have it. I think you pointed out Marcus Garvey ended up being deported, and he was not only deported from, I think it was Ghana. He was not only deported from there, he was deported from the United States. He was arrested twice in the United States. And so the ideas that Marcus Garvey disseminated, the articles that he wrote as a very accomplished journalist, these ideas were taboo. These ideas had to be suppressed. And as you have well pointed out, that period of the germination and the development of the national liberation movement in Africa, and for that matter, throughout the colonial world, Britain and France and the colonial powers in general saw it as very, very dangerous and subversive, and so it had to be suppressed. And this was one of the things that also led to the undoing of Garveyism as an organized force, because they went after the leadership, they went after the head, they went after Garvey. They were able to successfully break the organized Garveyite movement eventually, because there were also a number of weaknesses within the movement, and that is because, as some historians have pointed out, that although these were movements that were aimed at liberation and freedom, they also had elements of authoritarianism within these organizations, which allowed for splits within the organizations, which were then exploited by the colonial people and by the United States as well. The United States usually does not like to see itself as a colonial power. But what happened in the United States was the colonization of Black people within the borders of the United States. So that all of these, all of our people, whether it was in the United States, in Africa, in the United Kingdom, in the Caribbean, Central America, our people were under the yoke of colonialism, and some of the weaknesses of our organizations were used. But that would end up in a big conflagration, in the Caribbean in the 1930s.
Thank you so much for that. Ideas are powerful. I think that is one of the reasons Marcus Garvey's story should have been flying all across Africa. And of course, I was saying before that at the time Africa was not free. I don't even know if I can be confident to say in 2023 that Africa is free. It is difficult to even say it today. But anyway, um, so there were always, and there are always, and there will always be some influential individual in every society, irrespective of any circumstances. Can we point, or you did make mention of Frantz Fanon before, who did support the idea of Marcus Garvey, the Garveyism. But are there some other persons that we could see right in Africa, born in Africa, grew up in Africa, who saw the situation, what they were going through, and because of what they heard of Garvey, read about him, actually extend the hand of fellowship and try to build a common interest together so that they can find a common objective? Somebody right from Africa going out to reach out to their brothers in the diaspora in this line?
Okay. There is not there are not names that I can put a finger on at this time. As I have pointed out, I know there were a number of people who received Marcus Garvey's ideas very well, and they would have reached out to him, and they would have formed that bond with him. I cannot put my finger on names right now.